Hello class, today we will be briefly discussing the history of the populist movement. The origin of the populist movement begins in the Midwest, at the time in American history known as the Gilded Age. This was the time after the first Industrial Revolution in which America saw the sharp returns to laborers and the massive profits to the owners of industry who owned the means of production, creating large income inequality. The movement first began as a group known as the Farmers Alliance, but was eventually dissolved into the populist movement and would go on to establish the People's Party. The party would center itself around specific issues, arguably the most important being the establishment of a circulating currency by implementing silver into the currency of the US. The reason for doing so was because at this time in American history, the currency was based off of what was known as the gold standard, meaning the value of the US dollar was dependent on the supply of gold held by the US Treasury. How this came to affect farmers was that the gold standard often resulted in a deflation, meaning the farmers would lose value on their assets, thus the reason for their support of this measure that would commonly be referred to as free silver. Other issues they pushed for was a graduated income tax as is in place currently, the nationalization of railroads due to the heavy monopolies at the time on the industry which hurt farmers, and the direct election of U.S. senators. Now, at the time, U.S. senators were not elected by primary, but were chosen by the higher-ups within party organization, be they Democrat or Republican. In the election of 1892, the People's Party ran James Weaver, who we have a picture of on the right, for their presidential candidate. He went on to win 5% of the Electoral College and 9% of the popular vote, which was a fairly large success in terms of third-party presidential candidate runs. In the picture on the bottom left, we see a political cartoon that would be typical of the time, mocking the idea of the silver standard. Lastly, we are brought to the election of 1896, in which the People's Party would ascend William Jennings Bryan, a powerful orator, as you could see in this picture, to the top of the Democratic ticket, as against William McKinley, what was one of the most consequential elections in American history. The reason for this event being such an important piece of electoral history is that the big business interests in the United States heavily backed McKinley, establishing the Republican Party to be representative of big business to this very day. Though Bryan would run a very successful campaign championing the rights of workers, the financial backing of McKinley would have a large influence on the election, resulting in a win for the Republican Party with 61% of the electoral vote and 51% of the popular vote, receiving votes from industrialized areas of the country, which is juxtaposed to Bryan's domination of western and southern agrarian states. Throughout this process of establishing the People's Party, many of the People's Party's candidates would be elected to Congress, but over time, throughout the beginning of the 20th century, the party would mostly become dissolved into the Democratic Party.